right, welcome everyone to Food Forests with our guest speaker, Saskia Esslinger. I'm really happy to bring you this program. It's a collaboration between the Rural Cap Grow program and the Tribes Extension. And by way of land acknowledgement, of course, I am coming to you from Anchorage, which is Dena'ina land, but I just would also like to talk briefly about the concept of forest gardens because it really is an indigenous concept of forest management and food security that's been around for thousands of years. There's some really fascinating research about how indigenous people have used food forests throughout history. And during the talk, I will drop in the chat that we got just a few resources. If you're not familiar with the term food forest, it does go like way beyond what we consider traditional foraging, but actually includes things like, ecosystem management for the health of the forest. So I will also mention one of the reasons we're bringing this program today is because Rural Cap was awarded a grant from the USDA Forest Service to promote food forests and orchards in rural disadvantaged communities. And I know some of you have been hearing about that. We are just about to release our RFP. If you're signed up for this webinar, you will get that RFP announcement by email. It'll also be on our Rural Cap website. If you have questions about that, we can take those at the very end, but I want to leave as much time as possible. So for our guest speaker, Saskia, she is a permaculturist. She's the owner of her business, Teach Gardening, and she's going to tell us lots about food forests today. So welcome, Saskia.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm really happy to be here. This is one of my favorite subjects, and I could talk about it all day, but we have an hour, right? Is that correct? Okay. So with that, then I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can jump right into the presentation. As Emily said, I have a business called Teach Gardening, where I teach people how to garden. And I live in Homer, and I have two young boys whom I homeschool, and we grow most of our food from our gardens and our forest gardens. So it's really such a great lifestyle. And I hope that you all can learn a lot today about how to put a forest garden together and what it is, and experience this for yourself. So forest gardens, as Emily said, are not a new concept. They are actually one of the oldest ways, like they predate agriculture in how we used to, as tribes, as people, used to grow our food. And I would just like you all to start by closing your eyes for a few minutes and imagining yourself in a forest. So maybe this is a forest that is on your property or near you, or it's one that you grew up exploring. And I want you to wander into the forest. Maybe you're walking along a pathway and you're noticing the plants that are growing there. Maybe they are familiar to you as old friends. Maybe you don't know their names. But just notice what's growing as you walk along this pathway. And then you see something that you might want to check out a little further, so you decide to wander off the pathway. And you go into the undergrowth. What kind of undergrowth are you pushing through? What do you hear? What kind of smells are there? What are the other creatures that are sharing this space with you? And as you walk, you come along to a clearing, and here forest opens up. There's more sunshine, and there's different things growing here. What do you see in this clearing? Are there different birds, different creatures here? Maybe you notice a little bit of standing water nearby. you wander over and check that out. And what do you notice it with around the water? All right, so I invite you to come back to this room where you're at in the middle of winter now. Sorry to jar you out of that reverie. And just hold that thought about the forest in your mind as we go through these slides, because we're going to be talking about the principles of what makes a forest work and how to basically emulate a forest, to mimic a forest, the structure, the function of a forest, but create a forest that gives us more in terms of food and other benefits from it. So we're going to become, we basically are the keystone species of this forest ecosystem, and we're going to mold it a little bit more for our purposes, but also for the good of the ecosystem itself. So our goal is really to create a stable and resilient garden ecosystem that's driven by solar energy, and it largely maintains and renews itself. So if any of you guys are gardeners already, you know that annual gardens can be a lot of work. We are constantly having to go in there and weed and water and plant seeds and whatnot. And in a forest garden, we want to let nature take over and do most of the work for us. There will still be some definitely planting, cultivating, but most of the cultivating will be more like harvesting instead of just taking plants out, weeding. It's not that that like hard work, that hard toiling work. It's more like you go in and you do a little bit here and a little bit there, and that's the cultivation that it needs. And if you think about it, all animals in some ways garden. In permaculture, we say everything gardens. Everything has an effect on its ecosystem. And even if sometimes it might seem destructive, like for instance, the beavers, we think of that as kind of like very, wow, they're really affecting their environment and it seems destructive from the outside. But now we know that beavers are keystone species as well, right? When we take out the beavers, the whole health of the ecosystem goes down. And we can think of us humans in the same way. Sometimes our practices are very destructive, but we can also influence the ecosystems in a really positive way. So when we are thinking about forest gardens, we want to think about how to putting together a multi-layered ecosystem. So if you think about an annual garden, there's one layer. You've got the garden and you've got the annual plants that grow in there. That's one layer. But in a forest garden, we have the canopy layer, then we have the understory, then we have shrubs, and we have ground cover. We have lots of herbs growing up, root crops, vines. And if you think about a forest, nobody ever goes in and fertilizes the forest, right? It just fertilizes itself. The trees fall down from the canopy layer in the understory. The herbs die in the winter. The leaves fall on top of them, and it creates soil. It builds up soil every year after year instead of diminishing the soil like annual gardening does. So when we are planning our forest gardens, we really want to think in layers. How many layers can we get in there? And, depending on who you talk to, we can say that there can be many different layers, but we want to have at least 3 layers. 3 layers is really the minimum. I'm just going to check the chat for a second. Okay. But there are up to 9 layers of an edible forest garden. So the top layer is the canopy or the tall tree layer. And the canopy is, the tallest trees that we have. A lot of times in Alaska, especially, we don't include the canopy layer because In other climates down south, they have more than enough sun, whereas some shade is actually pretty good. But in Alaska, because the angle of the sun on the horizon, our sun isn't as intense. And so a lot of times for apple trees and fruit trees, we need more sun than what they would get than what they would need down south. So while sometimes, you can have a canopy layer, you don't have to plant that layer. A lot of people start with the subcanopy layer, which, like I said, are your fruit trees, your large shrubs, like elderberry or sea buckthorn, those kinds of things. And then we've got the shrub layer. These are smaller shrubs. We can think of like currants, gooseberries, wild rose, or different kinds of roses. That kind of thing would be in our shrub layer. And we can think of our herbaceous layer. So herbs are plants that grow up every year from the roots. So our perennials that grow up, you can think rhubarb is an example of an herb. We don't normally think of it as an herb, we think of it as a vegetable, but it dies back to its roots every year and then grows up fresh. And then ground cover are things that like kind of tend to grow in a mat across the ground. And there can be overlapping between the herbaceous layer and the ground cover. And a lot of these layers there's overlapping plants that could fill both niches. So for instance, like clover could be a ground cover, or knick, wild cranberry, low bush cranberry, those kinds of things. If you remember walking through your forest and seeing the ground cover and seeing what was covering the ground, you will notice that there was always something growing there. You very rarely see bare soil in a native forest. Okay, and then we can think of the underground layer. And of course, every plant has an underground component to it, but the underground layer, we're thinking about plants that are useful for us that grow underneath the soil. Jerusalem artichokes is a perennial that will grow underground. And of course, we know a lot of the different root vegetables that are annuals also grow under the ground. Maybe you guys might think of some other ones. And then the vertical or the climber layer is the vines. We don't have a ton of native vines, but there are a number that we can grow here, such as hardy kiwi and schizandra vine, also called magnolia vine, hops, things like that. And these things are handy to grow up. You can grow them up tree trunks sometimes. That's the way they would grow in nature. But a lot of times our forest gardens will have a fence around them. And so that's a great opportunity to grow them up fences. They can also make, kind of help to screen the view. Like if you have a not very great view, you can grow a really bushy vine on that fence or that area to kind of screen the view screen that view. And then the mycelial or the fungal layer is another thing to think about. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the aquatic or wetland layer. And this is just, like I said, not every forest garden will have this, but you can think of ponds, and there are lots of plants, edible plants that grow in ponds that you could include into your forest garden. And then the mycelial or fungal layer is the mushrooms. And there are also lots of edible mushrooms that we can grow in our forest gardens that will complement our plants. So one of the principles of forest gardens is having a lumpy texture. So if you remember walking through your forest, possibly, maybe when you were on your path, the ground was quite level. But once you stepped off the path, I'm sure you noticed that the land was not level. Like there's lots of like hills and tussocks and things that you have to step over and through and around to get where you're going. And this happens, when there's a big tree and the tree blows over in a storm and the root wad comes up, and that root wad slowly decomposes down to make a hill. And then the trunk also decomposes down to make a kind of a ridge. And in those those little microclimate areas, the depression left from the root wad, you will see a gathering of materials and an opportunity for new plants to come up. And it's really beneficial to have this lumpy texture of the ground. And so often us humans, we come into a site and we just like want to make it all flat. And it's not necessary. And it's not really desired either. If you're starting out with a flat site, you can make it more lumpy as you go. But if you're starting out with a lumpy site, there's no need to bulldoze it flat. Okay, because this is very natural and we want those little areas, those microclimates, those opportunities for different plants to take root and thrive. The other thing is thinking about the canopy. So this picture is showing basically how by using different trees of different heights, different shrubs, that the canopy is very lumpy. It's not a uniform canopy. And if you think of like a traditional orchard, all the trees are kind of the same height and it's a very uniform. And what this does is it makes it so that the sun can't get trapped in different areas. If you think about this picture, of course, this picture has palm trees in it and we won't be using palm trees, but you can think about the sun catching in different areas and some areas having more sunlight and some areas having less. And then how different species will thrive in those different spaces so that we are maximizing diversity. So when you are spacing trees in your forest garden, you want to definitely leave some space between them so that there will be room for other things to grow in between, and there's room for the sun to get in there through the different trees. And when we are planting these little twigs of trees, it can be so tempting to plant them too close together because it's hard to imagine what they're going to look like when they're older. But that's why we do our designs on paper first, so that instead of just planting things wherever we seem to be wanting to put them, if you plan it out on paper, you can plan for the finished canopy size and make sure that there is enough space in between the trees for other things to grow. So another principle, as I mentioned before, is no bare soil. And when you're walking through a forest, there's never any bare soil unless it's a well-worn path that's, been kept up generally. And this is because nature abhors a vacuum, right? There's never, if there's an opportunity for something to be growing there, it's growing. Or there is a covering of some kind, the leaves will come down and cover the area. If there's, so in the form of mulch. So anytime, I'm sure if you guys are gardeners, you've had this experience before where you plant your seeds and then in between where the seeds that you plant are, the weeds come up. And that's because the soil is bare and nature is going to plant seeds of her own if you let them. So we want to try to keep our soil covered at all times. This is one of the reasons why it's really great to have trees in your design, because the trees can actually provide the mulch that you need for your forest garden. But when you're just starting out, a lot of times you might have to import mulch. You also might want to think about, how can I plant other plants that can serve as mulch plants for my garden, so that you can do what's called chop and drop, where you chop off something like comfrey is a great mulch plant. You chop it off and then you place it around your other plants. And what it does is it mulches, it covers the soil. And as that comfrey breaks down, then it feeds your other plants. So even though we're not going to eat the comfrey, we put it in our forest gardens as a strategy to help us maintain and provide fertility for the other plants. So within that, we really want to have defined pathways for our forest garden, because we don't want people really trumping through and compacting the soil in the beds. We want to leave the beds for the plants to grow. So depending on how public your forest garden is, right? Like you guys are going to be planning maybe public forest gardens, and you will want to make sure that people know where to walk and where not to walk. Okay. And the pathways can be made out of a variety of different materials, depending on the frequency of visitors that you have. So if it's this picture, I think, is from a botanical garden of some sort, and they have main pathways that are flagstone, and then they have secondary pathways that are wood chips. I love wood chip pathways because they tend to break down really easily, and they retain water. And if you get weeds growing in there, they're pretty easy to pull out. But you will have to look and see, well, what is appropriate in my location? What do I have an excess of that can create pathways? Sometimes you can even create pathways out of a ground cover, such as clover, or somebody was telling me recently dwarf clover was their preferred pathway because it was, you didn't have to mow it, and it was a nitrogen fixer, and it was really good, stood up to being walked on. So if you don't have an availability of wood chips, there are tons of different options for pathways. Okay, the other thing is that we really want our forest garden to be self-fertilizing. So there's two different ways that we can help the forest become self-fertilizing. And one is to include nitrogen fixers. So nitrogen fixers are plants that take nitrogen out of the air, and fix it using in conjunction with bacterial nodules on their roots. And as as you cut back the top of that plant, parts of the roots will die off and release that nitrogen into the soil. And also the nitrogen in their leaves, as it falls down around the other plants, will make that nitrogen available. So there are lots of different kinds of nitrogen fixers. We're all probably familiar with peas and beans. And then I'm sure everybody's familiar with alder. It's a famous, wonderful native nitrogen fixer that we have. Siberian pea shrub is great because it also has these peas that are 20% protein. So if you have any animals in your system, like chickens, they can eat those peas, and they make a good food for them. Clover, as I mentioned, is a great nitrogen fixer. Lupin, another native plant that's wonderful, so beautiful, and great to use. Seaberry or sea buckthorn is one of my favorites because it's the berries that it produces are these bright orange berries, and they're a superfood. They are extremely high in antioxidants, vitamins, minerals. They use them, you can make a juice out of them. And in Eastern Europe, actually, it's really popular. Like it's a juice that they sell in the grocery stores, just like pomegranate juice. But you can make it yourself. And they also use sea buckthorn in cosmetics because it has so many healing properties. And it grows well up here. It's a nitrogen fixer. It's from Eastern Europe area, and Russia. And it grows really well in very poor soils. So it's a great one if you are looking to build your soil up. Russian olive and buffalo berry, those berries are more for wildlife, and they're less useful for people. And then fava beans is an annual, but it can be kind of fun to plant, especially in the beginning while you're building your soil. You can use annuals in your forest gardens, but we want to especially in the beginning, but we want to plan for it to be mostly perennials. Like I said, we want to diminish the amount of work and the amount of inputs that we have to put into it each year. Okay, and then the second type of self-fertilizing plants are called dynamic accumulators. And these are plants that are very good at drawing up minerals from deep in the soil. A lot of them are specialized in one kind of mineral or another. And you can actually do research on the internet and look up dynamic accumulators, and it will give you a chart of what specific mineral that these bring up. And if you happen to know that your soil is deficient in one thing or another, or if you're noticing nutrient deficiencies on your plants, you can grow certain dynamic accumulators and then compost them or put them around those other plants and use them to build up the concentrations of those nutrients in the soil. But what I like to do is just have a variety of dynamic accumulators in my forest garden so that there is kind of a broad range of nutrients that I'm using to increase the nutrition of my soil. So I already mentioned comfrey. It's an amazing dynamic accumulator. There's two types of comfrey. One is sterile and does not spread by seed, and one does spread by seed. So if you want to get the sterile variety so that you can avoid having comfrey coming up all over your garden, then you have to start with a plant that is sterile. You can't get seeds of the sterile variety. And some people like, it depends on you and what your goals are for the forest garden. I use not the sterile kind. So, but it's up to you. Okay, yarrow, another native, fantastic, a medicinal plant, as well as being a dynamic accumulator. Plantain, by this plantain, I'm not talking about the thing that looks like a banana. I'm talking about broadleaf plantain that is also called white man's footprint because the settlers brought it over from Europe, and the Native Americans noticed that wherever white men went, they noticed this plant growing, and it does look a little bit like a footprint. It has a broad leaf with kind of a pointy top, and it has lines going up from the bottom, veins going up from the bottom. And it's also medicinal, edible. You can eat the seed heads. I had some fried this year and they were so delicious. It was kind of fun. You can eat them kind of like you would a mini corn, nibble the seeds off of them. Dandelion, generally recognized as a nuisance plant, but is actually one of the best dynamic accumulators. There's so many uses of dandelions and can be welcomed in your garden. Stinging nettle, another native plant that is so beautiful and so nutritious for us. I have this theory that nature really provides the exact medicine that we need for our bodies on the soil, where we live. And my garden, when I moved to Homer, was full of nettle, and I just started eating it, so much of it, and really enjoying it so much. And I feel like it was exactly what my body needed. Okay, dock, chickweed, lamb's quarters. If you guys aren't familiar with these plants, maybe you have them already on your property, or maybe you want to invite them in. Horsetail is another one that a lot of people have problems with, but is actually a very useful plant. It's nice because you can use it as a mulch plant because there's no seeds in it. So it's fantastic. Or generally doesn't have seeds in it. Okay. So in general, we want to find plants that are self-maintaining. Like I said, we want to avoid the amount of work that we need to do in the forest garden. So on the left, there is a picture of bush cherry. And bush cherry is very similar to tree cherry, except for that it grows much smaller and it doesn't need to be pruned as much as a regular cherry tree. It's a little easier to grow, and it gives the cherries on it are a little bit smaller. They're a little bit more of a pain to pit, but they've got the same delicious cherry taste, and they're very prolific and fast growing. So that's one plant that I really enjoyed having in my forest garden. And then the other plant is sweet cicely, which is an herb that is a self-seeding annual. So in Alaska, we have a more limited choice of perennial plants, but there are a lot of plants that are self-seeding annuals. So these are plants that will grow in one season, set seeds, and then replant themselves. And that there again, that takes the work out for us of having to start the seeds every year and plant them anew. And sweet cicely is a wonderful medicinal herb. It's a very wonderful smelling, and it's really beautiful. So we really want to go for diversity in our ecosystem because diversity is the cornerstone of resiliency. So if you think about industrial agriculture and the monocrops that they plant, the corn, for instance, if you have one kind of disease that comes through, it can wipe out the whole cornfield. And all the corn is sucking up the same nutrient profile from the soil. So when you have a diversity of plants that have a diversity of needs, a diversity of sizes, they are using different parts of the soil, they're using different nutrients in the soil, and they're creating a confusion for any pests or diseases that come through. And you're much less likely to have any disease or pest problems when you have diversity in your garden. So whenever you're planting your forest garden, think about how you can get the most diversity in there. And looking for plants that also do well together. You can see in this example, was from my forest garden in Anchorage, and I have different herbs here. This was kind of near a pathway that led up to my house. So I like to plant lots of herbs in there, both annual and perennials. And then there's some chard, there's sunflowers, there's nasturtiums, there's a Juneberry plant off to the right that's still kind of small. There's chamomile and yarrow and tarragon. And then to the left of there is that sea berry plant. It's got those long silvery leaves, and you can't see the berries yet. Those come in the fall. So we really want to think about nectaries always flowering, really including beauty, not only for ourselves, as beauty is a human need that we have that is so often overlooked, but also for the birds and the bees and the butterflies to attract a diversity of critters to our garden and provide habitat for them. So I love to plant edible flowers and medicinal flowers, and just inviting in whatever might come up as well. This fireweed that was in the middle of this garden here was a complete volunteer, and it came in, and I thought, well, there's lots of uses for fireweed, so I left it. And sometimes you can just accept the gifts from nature. But yeah, there's just finding a variety of perennial flowers and annual flowers you can also add in there as well, and bulbs. Okay, so we really want to focus on multifunctional plants. So many of the plants that I've mentioned so far have more than one use. So they're not just edible, but they're also medicinal and or aromatic. Maybe they're beautiful. Maybe they produce fiber, such as nettles. Nettles produce an amazing fiber. There's been like this resurgence in people making nettle ropes and stuff like that. Dynamic accumulators, like I mentioned, and then mulch plants or bioaccumulators, like the comfrey that I was talking about. These are plants that grow a lot of mass quickly and can be used to fertilize other plants and accumulate lots of nutrition and just carbon. A lot of times it's a matter of feeding the soil life. And we do that by giving that lots of green matter to eat, and it turns it into soil for us and feeds our plants. So when I garden, I always think about feeding the soil, keeping it cool by keeping that mulch on, and giving it a variety of things to eat, the soil life. And then habitat plants, like I mentioned, seeing having lots of different habitat for different creatures in your garden. And it's also nice to, maybe not just rely on plants, but also to put out things like shallow dishes of water with some rocks in it for bees to land and drink, and maybe some bird baths. So providing all of the things that the that our that our creatures might need to enjoy our garden. And then insectaries, like I mentioned, having places for insects to hide and be. And what this does, it's not only for the bees and the butterflies, but it's also for those insects that will keep the pests under control. So the predatory wasps, all of those things. And it's creating a diverse ecosystem that has checks and balances. Okay, so I wanted to show you guys some examples of a forest garden in Alaska. And this was my house up in Anchorage when I used to live up there. I actually ended up selling it, unfortunately. But it was amazing. I only had this house for 7 years, and I really only worked on the forest garden for this one for about 6 years. And it was pretty amazing to see the difference between when we first got the house and when we sold it, which was in 2015. So this was right as after I sold the house and was leaving. And in this picture, you can see those seaberry bushes. That was that one off to the right of the arbor. That's a seaberry bush. They do get very big, very tall. It's a tall shrub for sure. In the back that you can see between the arbor is a cherry tree right near the house. And then in the foreground on the other side next to the arbor is a Saskatoon, or a serviceberry is the other name for it. Serviceberry, Saskatoon, or Juneberry. And then out front, there's some wormwood growing. There's lots of flowers. This is later in the fall, so some of the things have died back already. This is what it looked like earlier this summer from the other side. You can see the chamomile and the sweet cicely and some sunflowers and the huge seaberry forming a little bit of like a hedge in between the house and the road. And then also the Juneberry on the other side doing the same thing. And this little area of our garden, like I said, it was not even a very big space. It was right between the house and the street. And we wanted to kind of form a barrier in a way. So this is what it looked like when well, it wasn't right when we started. When we started, there was nothing growing. It was just grass, and kind of a really degraded lawn. It had been a rental for many years, and it hadn't been well taken care of. And so what we did was we sheet mulched this bed. And for those of you that aren't familiar with sheet mulching, you put down cardboard and then layers of organic matter, and then a thin layer of dirt. And then you can plant your plants right through the cardboard into the ground. Or you can plant just in the organic layer above the cardboard, depending on how deep rooted your plant is and how big it is. And because there was a slight hill between the house and the street, I decided to dig a swale. So a swale is a permaculture swale is a ditch that runs on contour. It is not a ditch that is intended to move water. It is only intended to hold the water long enough so that it can sink in. And what I found was that the swale made a huge difference in the amount that I needed to water that garden, because the water would actually sink in instead of running off onto the sidewalk. And when I put this garden in, you can kind of see it in this picture. I dug a swale for part of it. And then as I got closer to the driveway, I like ran out of time. I don't know. I lost steam, and I didn't finish the swale all the way to the end. And I thought, it's not that big of a hill. It probably won't make any difference. So I just decided to go ahead and sheet mulch that area. And what I found was there was a huge difference between the part that had a swale and the part that did not have a swale. The part that did not have a swale, when it rained, the the sidewalk turned black with all the organic material that was running onto it. And where there was a swale, there was very little runoff. And also the part that did not have a swale needed much more water than the part that did have a swale. So what I did was the next year I came back through and dug the swale the rest of the way to the end, and then it all worked much better. So you can see that there's just some baby plants put in here, and they don't look like anything at this point. You know, this is the first year we had them planted. There was some Amur choke cherry trees, which I wouldn't recommend planting. They were very fast growing, which was one of the things that we wanted, but they're not the same as the invasive choke cherries, but they also weren't particularly useful as far as like providing food. But then you can also see that some, let's see, there's the bush cherries and the Saskatoon and some other stuff in there. So the next year I started another forest garden on this side of the house. So that's the corner of that building you can see is a greenhouse. So it was kind of the far side of the garden. I couldn't really see it very well from the house. So I kind of had intended it to be an area that would need less care, but that I could still grow the forest garden kind of out of sight a little more. So interestingly enough, I had already planted some black currants along this side of the year or two. No, it was 2 years before this that I had planted the black currants, and they just did nothing the first couple of years, planted in that awful lawn. They just sat there and did nothing. And then as soon as I put the sheet mulch around them and gave them companion plants, they took off. They were so happy to not be growing in a lawn anymore. And then I added a bunch of other plants. I added honeyberries and red currants and apple trees. In the back, I put some hazelberts, which are a cross between hazelnuts and filberts. They never produced any nuts for me. But I know that Josh Smith is going to be talking in one of these, I think next week or soon. And he's been doing a lot of experiments with nuts that will grow in Alaska, which is super exciting. Very excited about that. So this is 2009. By 2010, we've already seen a lot of growth in this area. And you can see that the plants are really bursting there's a compost pile actually in front. And back there, you can kind of see the apple trees and the hazelberts. Those are the little things in the back right kind of corner. There's a kiwi that's growing up that fence line, that string that's going up to the fence. So that's really just 1 year. There's a huge difference. Okay, then 2014. So 4 years later, things are huge. This is a red currant bush in front that was just enormous. Loved it, loved it, loved it. And off to the right is an apple tree that was starting to produce really heavily. In behind the red currant are Jerusalem artichokes. So Jerusalem artichokes are a tuber. They're related to sunflowers, and they actually do produce little yellow sunflowers. But when you can dig up the tubers in the spring or the fall, and they have a kind of starch in them that's inulin that's really good for diabetics. So very healthy food for us to eat. And off to the left, you can see a Siberian pea shrub kind of back in that left corner of the picture. So lots of diversity going on here. Lots of different stuff. It's hard to show these forest gardens in pictures. It's like one of those things like you have to walk through it to really be able to experience it and see everything that's actually happening there. So when you are putting your forest garden together, like I mentioned, I really suggest that you make your designs on paper first. And I know that if you're applying for the grant, that this is definitely encouraged as well. And with permaculture, I always like to start with really articulating the goals for your forest garden. So being very clear about what you are trying to do with it. Are you trying to make a demonstration for the people, or are you trying to produce the maximum amount of food and the maximum amount of medicine, or are you trying to use mostly native plants? Really being very clear about what benefits you want to see come out of your forest garden. And the more clear you are with your goals, the more likely you are to actually achieve what you want to achieve, of course. And then you'll want to choose a space. Um, Defining where is the space that this forest garden is going to go into. If you're going to use things like fruit trees and a lot of berry bushes, and you have moose around, then it's always, or deer, it's a good idea to put a fence up in order to keep those kinds of, to keep to keep them from being eaten down. So defining the space where you're going to put it. And then before you plant anything or even make a design, you're going to want to do lots of observations. What is happening on this site already? This is so, so important. I can't stress this enough, that observing your site very well before you start can save you so much trouble and heartache, and you can actually make it work so much better. So the more time that you can spend observing your site, what's happening in there right now? What is the wind like? How does the water flow across your site? What happens when it rains a lot? Looking at all the different aspects in all different weathers, seeing who is already using that area. If it's a thoroughfare for moose, it might not be a great spot. So, kind of seeing what's already happening in there. And then boundaries are looking at what are the areas of opportunity within that area that you chose. What are the boundaries of the site? Are there different ecosystems within the site? Maybe part of the site is a forest already and part of it is a field. Then acknowledging those boundaries that are there already can be really useful. Are there any challenges to that site that you've noticed? Maybe neighbors that aren't so friendly, or pedestrians or homeless people, or whatever you think that might possibly be challenging for your project. And then resources, it's really helpful just to make a list of all the resources that might possibly benefit you in your project. So this includes listing all the different materials that you have available on your site and in your surrounding area. Maybe you have a neighbor that's a farmer and has lots of manure. Fantastic. List that down. Maybe you know somebody, maybe it's people that can be a resource for you, people that have lots of energy that can do some work, or people that have knowledge that can help. Maybe it's some really great gardeners that are willing to help out with this project. So gathering, like, what are all the resources that you have in your community that you can tap into for this project. And then when you're ready to sit down to make your design, you can start with the infrastructure. So what needs to happen with the infrastructure for this project? Do you need water? Eventually our forest gardens, we don't want to have to water them. But in the beginning, you will need to think of some water. So is there a water spigot close by? Can you trap more water, like I was talking about with the swales, to help feed your plants? And then you'll want to put in some pathways so that you can get around your forest garden. It's really good to not make your pathways too far apart so that you can kind of reach and tend into your forest without stepping into it. You can use a few stepping stones, but in general, pathways are preferred. And there's lots of different ways that you can do this. I really like to have at least one main meandering pathway around your forest garden so that people can kind of take a loop around and see what's happening. And then maybe there are secondary pathways off of the main loop that are more for tending rather than viewing. Or you can have keyhole beds, which a keyhole bed is one where you just step into this little keyhole and then you can tend a wide area all around you from this one spot. So it looks a little bit like a keyhole. But make sure that you're not tending stuff that's too far off from a pathway, but generally 2 feet is about as far as we can reach from a pathway into the garden in order to tend. And any more than 2 feet, and we are starting to hurt our back. That doesn't mean that you need to have rows of 4-foot wide beds with pathways on either side. You can definitely make, like I said, a winding pathway is going to be a lot more natural looking than a straight edged pathway. So think about how you can meander it, how you can add curves into your pathways to increase the edge between the pathways and the garden beds, so that you can reach all areas of your garden beds from the pathway. And then think about any fences and structures that you want in your forest garden. Does there need to be a shed for tools, or a processing station, or a composting area, or a place to gather for workshops? Think about all the different functions that you want your forest garden to have, and make sure to put those into the design. And then we'll start with the largest trees, either the canopy or the medium tree layer. And of course, this is if you are starting from scratch. If there are already trees there, you don't have to clear them out. You can work with what's already there. So you might need to take selectively out a few trees or bushes, but you can generally, work with what you have. And decide what you want to keep and what you want to replace with something else. So like I mentioned, a lot of times we like to start with our fruit trees, because fruit is such a wonderful, delicious, familiar thing that we can all get around and provide lots of fruit for our communities. But then also thinking about all the berries. The berries are so nutritious for us, and really the superstars of Alaska. We can grow berries like nobody's business up here. And while fruit can be more challenging, a little more labor intensive to grow fruit, berries often take very little care and upkeep to produce well.
Saskia, I'm going to interrupt you for just a sec, because
Sure.
you're welcome to keep going past 1 o'clock. I know a lot of people have to leave. But please stick around for as long as you want. We do have a question hi, Savannah. She's wondering, do you compost your food scraps, and what's the best way to incorporate them in your home forest garden?
Yeah, great question. So I have kind of a hierarchy of food scraps. The best ones go to the chickens, things that they'll eat. And then a lot of times I will just do what's called pit composting, where I will dig a hole where there's nothing really growing, and I will bury my food scraps in there and then cover them over. I really like that method for forest gardens, because you don't have to really disturb this soil so much. I mean, you're digging a hole, but it's a good way to kind of introduce more organic matter into the area. And I like to do this especially with stinky or smelly food scraps like fish, or like after I make bone broth, I will bury the bones into the garden. Yeah. Thanks, Emily, for relaying that question. Okay,
And
so Mhm.
I don't, sorry to interrupt you again.
That's okay.
If there's other questions, put them in the chat, and we'll get them answered for you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so basically you kind of work up from there. So you're going to choose herbs to complement the shrubs, and make sure to choose some nitrogen fixers and dynamic accumulators. Where is there an opportunity for vines, roots, or fungi? Oftentimes the fungi does best in those shady areas that don't grow plants as well. So we had some King Stropharia, or they're also called wine caps, growing in the fence, like on the north side of the fence, down beneath the gardens, in the shade, where they were getting lots of water and shade, and they grew great there. So after you kind of make a design, then it's really good to go back and imagine, how is this going to look in 15 to 5 to 20 years? What happens when the fruit trees are mature? What is it going to look like? And then you might need to make adjustments until you get a design that's finalized. And it's like I mentioned before, it's so easy to stick in more plants than you need. And this is where sometimes using annuals comes in handy, because you can fill in the gaps with annuals while the perennials are still really small and still get a yield. But then you don't have to worry about taking them back out again when the other plants need more room. Okay, and then make an implementation plan for your garden, and make sure to um, figure out, you don't have to plant everything at once. You don't have to do the whole thing all in one year. But a lot of times it's really good to smother all the existing grass. Um, you can use hugelkultur, which is a form of wooden mounds using basically rotted logs and stuff as the basis of your garden, and then covering it with organic matter, soil and dirt, or compost and dirt, and then growing in that. And as those logs break down slowly, they release nutrients, and they also hold a lot of water. So that can be a really great technique to use in some circumstances. And it also adds contours and microclimates to your forest garden. So there's just a couple of resources that you can use if you want to read more. This 2-volume set, Edible Forest Gardens, is like the Bible on forest gardens. It's very technical. They've got a lot of information out there. So it can be a little bit overwhelming, but it's a great way to nerd out. If you want something a little bit not quite so heavy and nerdy, then I would suggest one of the other books. So, okay, that was all I had today. So if you guys have more questions or comments, I know I went through it really fast. There's really so much more to tell you about forest gardens. So I'm sorry that I was talking so fast.
No, that was really wonderful. I learned a lot, and I know that's the second time I've seen the program, and like really every time I see it, it's like reminds me of things that I need to remember. It's so great. Thank you. So please, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions, or put it in the chat. We're happy to hear from you. And you can see the chat there, Saskia. Lots of thank yous.
Yeah. And if you guys, also, I just wanted to put it out there that I do teach a gardening course that's year-long. And if you really want to learn more about regenerative gardening, food forest is a part of what I teach, but all types of gardens, and putting food by, and all of that kind of stuff. And I have an opening right now. So if you're interested in getting that, or learning more about that, you can go to my website, teachgardening.com.
And Saskia was my mentor for when I got my permaculture designer certificate. So yay, highly recommend. All right.
Cool.
I'm not seeing any other questions. I'd actually, so Saskia, I remember you telling me your favorite suppliers for ordering bushes and trees, maybe your favorite Alaska ones and your favorite outside ones.
Yeah. So there are a number of Alaskan suppliers. Gosh, I'm trying to remember. There's several places down on the peninsula here. Alaska Berries, I'm pretty sure. And other people, feel free to jump in here. And O'Brien's Garden, I believe. I haven't actually been there, but I've heard lots of good things about them. And then there's also places in the valley, but I'm not sure. Like I said, I haven't been up there as much in the recent years since I've moved to Homer. And then for out of state, when I was doing my forest garden, there weren't very many local suppliers. So I ordered my stuff from St. Lawrence Nursery in upstate New York. It's a very small family-run nursery that has great product, but they run out pretty quickly. So you have to order it like in January, a lot of times, maybe next January. And then the other one that I really like is called One Green World, and that's out of Portland, and they specialize in so many different edible forest garden crops. They have the best selection of hardy kiwis. So that's kind of a fun one too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and someone asked if the year-long course is over Zoom, and it is. So most of my students are from Alaska. I have a few from other places, but it's really fun to like kind of connect with other gardeners right here in the state and chat about stuff. Yeah, it's a real small course. I generally only have like 5 to 10 people on each call, so it's really personalized. I can really help you with your gardens.
Thanks, everyone.